I am Laura Cozzi, the IEA Chief Energy Modeler, and I'll be your host and moderator today. After having gone through the impacts of the COVID crisis for the energy sector on Monday, focusing on electricity on Tuesday and fuels yesterday, today we go deep dive into a very topical issue, which is reaching net zero emissions for the energy sector. For the reason of the very topic of this event, we have the pleasure to co-host this event together as part also of London Climate Action Week. If you're joining us today for the first time, we are trying to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you have questions for our speakers, please interact with us through whatever means you're following us, being YouTube, LinkedIn, but also please don't hesitate to send your questions via email. The email address you should be using is weoweek@iea.org. As we have had a lot of questions coming through over the past couple of days, some have been recurring ones and are rather technical, I would like to inform our viewers that the session slides are going to be made available at the end of this live stream, as well as the registration and recording of this event. How are we going to run this webinar is in the following way. First of all, IEA's colleagues, Christoph McGlade and Daniel Crow, will start giving you the key findings from the World Energy Outlook on our scenarios on reaching net zero emissions. But importantly, we are really very fortunate today to have four leading minds on energy and climate change from around the world. We'll have joining us Ed Webber, is the Deputy Director for International Climate Actions in the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Ed is actually leading the teams that aim at accelerating the global low carbon energy transition with really a view to COP26. So a big welcome to Ed. Also welcome to Sarah Ladislaw. Sarah is a Senior Vice President at the Center for International and Strategic Studies in the United States, where she's also leading their program on energy security and climate change. A big welcome to Sarah. We continue a bit on our world tour. We are very happy to have Glenn Peters joining us today from Oslo. Glenn is the research director at the Center for International Climate Research there. Glenn is also a loyal World Energy Outlook peer reviewer, together with Sarah actually. Is one of the key IPCC lead authors and probably one of the key influencers on energy and climate in social media. So a big welcome to Glenn. And my big thanks and big welcome go to Professor Zhu Ji, who is joining us today from Beijing, very late there. Thank you for joining us so late. Professor Zhu Ji doesn't really need an introduction, but he is CEO and President of Energy Foundation China. And Professor Zhu Ji has a tremendous amount of achievements on energy and climate. In particular, we all know was instrumental in putting forward the NDCs for China back in 2015, and at the time he was Deputy Director General of China's National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation. So big welcome to Professor Zhu Ji. Before turning the floor to my colleagues for the introductory presentation, I'd like to give a couple of words to those of you who are not familiar with the World Energy Outlook. In 2008, back then our now executive director was leading the World Energy Outlook, and we started introducing, so 13 years ago, climate scenarios. Then since then, there are an annual feature of the World Energy Outlook. So since 2008, so for the past 13 years, on an annual basis, we are making huge modeling exercise, updated and published every year. Why do we think it's important to update climate scenarios, energy and climate scenarios on an annual basis? Is that there are three factors that are changing very quickly every year, and in fact accelerating every year. The first is science. Science is changing. We learn every year more, being on carbon budgets on the impacts of climate change. And so we follow IPCC very closely and all what entails science and try to incorporate it on a yearly basis as quickly as possible in our understanding and models. The second is that we are living through very transformational times in the energy sector, which means that we are witnessing cost reductions, very quick cost reductions, advancement in innovation and technology, and we try to incorporate them through collecting data on a yearly basis. So tracking what's happening across the energy sectors in production and consumption is another key feature, the update of technology, innovation, and cost. And third is the policy aspect. Policies are evolving very, very quickly. It's just over the past few weeks, in fact, we have had a number of announcements from President Xi Jinping of China announcing net zero emission, and just ending yesterday with number 10 in the UK with the 10 action plan. So we are trying really to keep up to date and produce timely analysis on this. This year, we have been updating with these lenses our sustainable development scenario, which we have introduced a few years ago, reaches the Paris Agreement, but also meets, importantly, sustainable development goals, including the access crisis that we're still living. We didn't stop there. We introduced for the first time a net zero emission by 2050. And Christoph and Daniel now will take you to our findings on what does it take for the energy sector in terms of technology, investment, electricity, end uses, and importantly, behavior. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Laura. So I would like to start by just briefly looking at the emissions that we have occurring in our stated policy scenario. So in our stated policy scenario, we include the policy intentions and targets that have been announced by governments, but we only include the goals if they've been backed up by detailed measures to ensure that they can be achieved. Now, the energy sector, of course, has been severely affected by the pandemic, and we estimate that CO2 emissions in 2020 are going to fall by around about 7% from 2019 levels. But in the stated policy scenario, CO2 emissions rebound quite quickly, and they return to 2019 levels just before 2030 and remain roughly stable after that. And this trend is far from meeting our international targets on climate, including the Paris Agreement. And if we were to continue this trajectory of emissions, by the end of the century, we would have a temperature rise of around about 3 degrees. We see a very different picture in the sustainable development scenario, as Laura mentioned. And in this scenario, emissions fall to zero by around 2070. And the sustainable development scenario also ensures that we achieve universal energy access to all by 2030, and also have a substantial reduction in air pollution. So to achieve the sustainable development scenario, it's going to be critical that the recovery from the pandemic is as sustainable as possible. And policies are also going to be crucial. We've seen an increasing number of countries, including, for example, the European Union, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and many others, making pledges to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050 or potentially even earlier. We've also recently heard the major new announcement by China to achieve net zeros by 2060. And along with the net zero pledges by 2050, all of these are achieved in full in the sustainable development scenario. But we can see that this only really gets us halfway to where we would need to be in 2050. And really much more rapid and more ambitious action is needed by everyone if we are to meet the goals of the sustainable development scenario. The announcements of countries and also an increasing number of companies to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 has also been increasing interest on what it would mean for the energy sector globally to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And as Laura mentioned, we examined this issue for the first time in this year's Outlook. Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is a very important milestone because it would limit the temperature rise to around about 1.5 degrees, as mentioned in the Paris Agreement, without a large level of net negative emissions globally. Achieving net zero emissions globally by 2050 is going to require a far-reaching set of actions that goes above and beyond the already very ambitious measures that are included in the sustainable development scenario. And decisions over the next decade are clearly going to be critical to this. And it's also important to remember that the decisions and actions that need to be carried out in order to achieve either the sustainable development scenario or the net zero by 2050 case They have to be carried out at a time when the world is trying to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. And in total, if we look at 2030 there, we see that emissions in the net zero by 2050 case need to be around about 6.5 billion tons lower than the sustainable development scenario. If we look at the makeup of how we can achieve this level of emissions reductions, the power sector is already front and center of efforts to reduce emissions from levels in the stated policy scenario down to the sustainable development scenario. And the power sector would also deliver about 40% of the additional reductions between the sustainable development scenario and the net zero by 2050 case. And as a result, in the net zero 2050 case, CO2 emissions from the power sector would decline by around about 60% over the next 10 years. Additional changes in end uses also deliver an additional 2 billion tons of reductions from the sustainable development scenario to the net zero 2050 case. And then there's also an important contribution made from behavior changes. There are some small behavior changes included in the sustainable development scenario. This includes things like increased recycling and the use of public transport. But in the net zero by 2050 case, behavior changes are far more wide-ranging. And they account for around about 30% of the difference between those two scenarios. And on the next few slides, we'll go through in a bit more detail as to what it would mean to achieve these goals in each of these different areas. So looking first at the power sector. In the stated policy scenario, coal-fired power generation remains broadly flat from 2020 onwards. There is a small shift in generation from the least efficient plants to slightly more advanced designs, but we don't see any major changes overall in the picture going forwards. In a sustainable development scenario, we see a very different picture emerging. Emissions from coal-fired power plants drop by more than 50% over the next 10 years. And the way of doing this is based on our three-pronged strategy of retrofitting, repurposing, or retiring existing coal-fired power plants. And in addition, in a sustainable development scenario, beyond coal-fired power plants that are already under construction, no new plants without CCS would come online. Nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize that some coal-fired capacity would continue to exist in a sustainable development scenario, even if it only runs for a small fraction of the time, because these plants can help to ensure flexibility and avoid some costly investment into other options. In the net zero by 2050 case, the decline in emissions from coal-fired generation is even more stark. So emissions from coal-fired power plants fall by more than 75% over the next 10 years. And we see that the least efficient coal plants, generation and emissions from these falls to zero by 2030. The application of carbon capture and storage can help to reduce emissions from existing plants, but really the vast majority of emission reductions that we see in the net zero case comes from reducing operations, either by reducing the amount of time which they operate or by retiring them early. So how can we manage such a large reduction in generation? Solar PV is absolutely going to be central to the efforts that are required in the net zero by 2050 case. And we can see here at the bottom of the chart on the right there, the previous record levels of solar capacity that have been installed across a number of major regions around the world. So for example, we can see that the highest level of solar capacity that was installed in the United States occurred a few years ago and was around about 20 gigawatts. In the net zero by 2050 case, solar PV is clearly going to need to be deployed at a pace well beyond previous records. So we see, for example, on a global level, in 2020, we expect there to be around about 90 gigawatts of new solar PV capacity installed. In the net zero by 2050 case, we have 500 gigawatts installed by 2030. And of course, other low carbon forms of generation, such as wind power or nuclear in countries that haven't opted out of it, would also need to scale up very rapidly in parallel to ensure that we can meet rising electricity demand in the net zero case.
Thanks, Christoph. So the power sector, as we've seen, clearly needs to be front and center of efforts to reduce emissions in line with the NZE 2050 case. But by itself, this wouldn't be enough. it's also vital to reduce CO2 emissions from end uses. In the NZE 2050 case, emissions from these sectors falls by 1/3 between 2019 and 2030. So to give some examples of what this means, close to half of the existing building stock in advanced economies is retrofitted by 2030, and 1/3 is retrofitted elsewhere. Half of all air conditioners sold globally between 2020 and 2030 are the most efficient models available, and around a quarter of total heat used in industry in the NZE 2050 in 2030 comes from electricity and low carbon fuels such as hydrogen, up from negligible levels today. So just to focus on the transport sector and take a slightly deeper dive on that, in the steps, in the stated policy scenario, there is continued growth in the deployment of electric cars, although only very modest increases in electric or fuel cell trucks. In the SDS, there is much greater growth, with nearly 40% of passenger cars sold by 2030 being electric, up from around 2.5% in 2019. But in the NZE 2050 case, over 50% of passenger cars sold in 2030 are electric. And we see an even bigger difference in trucks, where sales of medium and heavy duty trucks that are powered by fuel cells or batteries grows from next to nothing today to nearly 1/3 of the total sales by 2030. So alongside this, global battery manufacturing capacity would need to double every 2 years between now and 2030. And hydrogen production and distribution infrastructure would also need to ramp up substantially. So we've seen on the last slide that as well as efforts in the power sector, it's vital to reduce end-use emissions by rapidly increasing deployment of low-carbon technologies in buildings, transport, and the industrial sector as well. So we have to treat end users as well as power sector and supply. However, the speed of emissions reductions in the NZE 2050 case would be hard to achieve through structural changes in the energy sector alone, especially if demand for energy services rises in line with expected population and economic growth. So this highlights that it's critically important to address emissions from existing energy infrastructure. And there's some analysis in this year's WEO which shows that CO2 emissions from today's infrastructure, including infrastructure that's under construction today, if it were operated as in the past, and that's the crucial point, would lock in around 1.65 degrees of warming. So in the SDS, these so-called locked-in emissions are tackled mainly on the supply side, for example, by reducing output from coal-fired power plants or retrofitting with CCUS, as Christoph mentioned before. But in the NZE 2050, it's necessary to go further. So it's also necessary to reduce emissions from existing end-use assets as well. And this is where we see a role for behavior changes. So in the net zero by 2050 case, we've assessed a range of behavior changes across the residential, road transport and aviation sectors. And all these changes have one goal in mind, which is to reduce CO2 emissions. Most of the behavior changes in the residential sector have no structural barriers to their adoption, and so could happen fairly quickly, which is why residential dominates early on in the period in 2021. In contrast, many of the changes in road transport and aviation would need the support of infrastructure, for example, cycle lanes or high-speed rail, that would be built over time. And so we see the savings from transport and aviation building over time. We estimate that around 60% of the emissions savings in 2030 could be supported or influenced by government policies. The changes with big emissions impacts in the residential sector include turning down heating in homes by 3 degrees and also reducing demand for cooling. And these two measures save around 0.5 gigaton of CO2 straight away. Another 0.5 gigaton could be saved in road transport by driving 7 kilometers an hour more slowly, with the biggest savings in passenger aviation coming from a 3/4 reduction in long-haul flying for leisure purposes. And on top of these, a host of other measures we've looked at could combine to save over 2 gigatons of emissions by 2030, accounting for 1/3 of the emissions reductions in the NZE 2050 compared to the SDS, and around 18% of the emissions reductions in the NZE 2050 compared to the stated energy policy scenario. So the specific measures we've looked at illustrate the potential for behavior changes to cut emissions, but they definitely won't be able to be implemented by everyone all the time. So cultural preferences, affordability, and personal welfare will prove key in determining where, when, and to what extent these changes could happen. It shouldn't also be forgotten that there are many parts of the world in which these sorts of behavior changes are simply not relevant. Around 800 million people today lack electricity access, and 2.6 billion people lack access to clean cooking. And under stated policies, these numbers improve only slightly by 2030. So the SDS and the NZE 2050 case both deliver universal access by 2030, demonstrating that there doesn't need to be any conflict between access goals and climate goals. Back to you, Laura, I think.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you, Daniel, for this very comprehensive and insightful presentation. So let me turn now to our panelists, and I'd like to start with Ed. So Christoph showed a very important picture on what needs to happen to the power sector, and in particular on coal and coal generation. Clearly, when you look at what's happening with stated policies, we are not expecting a big drop in emissions from power generation, but you specifically are leading work on this important point, so coal emissions under the COP presidency. So would you like to tell us what would be your dream goal out of COP26 of this work you're doing on coal emissions?
Well, thank you, Laura, and thanks to Christoph and Daniel for their presentation. It was fascinating to see. And thank you again for this offer to speak to you about the UK's COP26 presidency and our plans on energy specifically. Just by way of context, I think this year's World Energy Outlook is a particularly important one. On the one hand, it's clearer than ever that we are not on track for the temperature goals that we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement. The UNEP says we need a 5-fold increase in ambition to keep the 1.5 goal within our reach. And so the UK's COP presidency comes at a time when we must reach a tipping point for global carbon emissions and set the conditions for an accelerating decline in emissions towards our net zero and Paris goals. But I think the analysis we just heard, although it may be not immediately self-evident, actually does offer us some reasons for hope. Because whilst the COVID-19 crisis has clearly had a serious short-term impact on the world's energy system, it also offers a new window of opportunity in the short and medium term to close the emissions gap to Paris and accelerate the zero carbon transition through stimulating a sustained green recovery. So that's the backdrop for our COP26 presidency. And while there are plenty of detailed negotiations to come, Glasgow itself is not ultimately about landing some grand new negotiated deal. The real test of success and what we are looking to achieve is about raising ambitions and about making demonstrable action in the real world. So individual governments clearly have a big role to play here. And you mentioned, Laura, yesterday's announcement by the UK's Prime Minister for a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution across the power, transport and industry and building sectors, backed by £12 billion of investment that should create or support up to 250,000 jobs. But ultimately, we will only make the scale and pace of change that we need through a more coordinated action between governments and across the whole of society. And by working together, we can make the zero carbon transition faster, cheaper, and easier for all. So that's why the UK has chosen, under our presidency, a number of priority themes that we're looking to unlock exactly this kind of real world action. Those themes are clean energy, finance, zero emission vehicles, nature, and adaptation and resilience. So I'm going to turn and focus primarily on energy transitions today. To meet our Paris goals, we need the global transition to clean power to be at least 4 times faster than it is at present. And this means ending unabated coal power in developed countries by 2030, in other major emitters by 2040, and in developing countries by 2050. And of course, as the demand for energy grows, the power sector must both grow to meet that demand whilst decarbonising at the same time. So while I'm not sure I can say precisely what a dream outcome would look like, what I can say is that we're looking for genuinely ambitious outcomes in at least 4 key areas. Firstly, we are seeking to increase the number of countries committing to an accelerated phase out of coal, building on the role played by the Powering Past Coal Alliance. The PPCA has grown to over 100 members, and roughly 30% of the global coal fleet is now under a phase out commitment. Secondly, we're committed to using our engagement with other governments and with the private sector to push for an accelerated end to the international financing of new coal plants. Thirdly, we are seeking to work with other key donors and recipient countries to strengthen the clean energy offer available to them. This includes, for example, emerging economies with rapidly growing demand like Vietnam, who have signaled they plan to review half of their coal pipeline, as well as countries like Kenya, who have the chance to leapfrog coal in their development entirely. And finally, we are looking to establish a new financial framework for financial and technical assistance to support countries with strong existing dependence on coal power and mining in making a stable and just transition. And this includes countries like South Africa, where the UK has just announced a £3 million project through ESMAP, looking to repurpose retiring coal plants with Eskom. And to drive forward these efforts, particularly the last 2 I mentioned, the UK recently announced that we will establish a new COP26 Energy Transition Council to accelerate the transition from coal to clean energy. The Council will bring together leaders of the global power sector, and we are delighted that the IEA have agreed to play a leading role in this effort. They will be joined by IRENA, multilateral development banks, governments, businesses, and civil society. And the purpose of the Council will be to ensure that for every country considering new power generation, clean power is the most attractive option available to them. And we will strengthen our collective support through development assistance, climate finance, and the sharing of expertise to help the most coal-dependent communities achieve a just transition. So all of this is not going to be easy, and as the WEO analysis makes clear, there are major financial, political, technical, and socioeconomic challenges to overcome, especially in dealing with the legacy of around 2,000 gigawatts of installed coal power capacity globally. And that means retiring a large coal plant every week for the next 30 years. And our approach cannot be about lecturing and posturing. It must be about supporting countries to show political leadership and to develop the plans and policies that work in their different national contexts. To quote Minister Kuzi, Energy Secretary for the Philippines, when asked about whether he would ban coal power following the announcement of a moratorium in the Philippines, he said, "We are doing what is good for our country. If we immediately stop coal, where do we get the power?" And this is the question that collectively we need to be able to answer. But equally, there are many reasons to be hopeful too. The economic case for building new coal over clean energy is essentially over. And even in the stated policy scenario, coal is now in decline. And over the coming few years, it is likely to become cheaper to replace most existing coal plants with new clean energy than to continue operating them. And this underlines, I think, the non-linear nature of the pace of change as parallel factors impact and reinforce each other, whether it's falling renewable costs, rising fossil fuel costs through risk and change in investor sentiment, or changing social attitudes and so on. And these system dynamics mean that what can seem impossible today can quite quickly become inevitable tomorrow. We've also seen a number of recent developments that are promising as well. You mentioned the net zero commitments from China, also from Japan and South Korea, the new coal moratoria in the Philippines, discussions on transitions in Central and Eastern Europe, and the withdrawal of major banks from new coal developments like KEPCO and the Industrial Commercial Bank of China. So there are reasons to be really optimistic here as well. And finally, I wanted to underline that this is not just about big governments and big institutions acting. And I think the point you made about behaviour changes is reinforces our message. We need all of you and all parts of society to play their part. So to name just a few ways how you can help us make sure that COP26 helps accelerate that transition that I've been talking about, here are a few things. Firstly, you can join the Race to Zero campaign by making a net zero commitment to 2050, an action plan underpinned by a science-based target. Secondly, you can commit to going coal-free in your own organisation or in your own jurisdictions by joining the PPCA, as I mentioned earlier on. And you can commit to 100% renewable electricity by joining the RE100 campaign, or electrifying your own vehicle fleets, your own car fleets, by joining the EV100 campaign. So I hope, Lara, that gives you a full enough answer to your question and what we are looking to achieve from COP26 in this space. And I really look forward to the rest of the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. If I can summarize your excellent introduction, is that really the keyword for the COP26 is real world action. So we are certainly very happy to support in all the way we can success for COP26. And I would like to, maybe before moving to Sarah, underline one point that I think is in particular important that you raised. We should be supporting countries and not lecturing. And this is exactly the spirit of our clean energy transition program, in which we work with emerging economies around the world, in particular on electricity, and supporting them on raising renewables in the power sector and beyond to go to a cleaner and secure electricity system. Thank you very much, Ed, and good luck for COP26 overall. We turn now to the US, that clearly had all eyes on them over the past couple of weeks. To Sarah, we have been seeing in the United States actually emissions declining for the past several years. So the peak in the US emissions was over a decade ago, 2005, and emissions started declining particularly in the power sector. This is one of the countries where we really had a huge coal to gas switch, increase in renewables. Now we are seeing a change in the US administration. Of course, we don't know yet which policy will be introduced by the US administration, but it would be very interesting for us to have your views on which clean energy technologies you think may have the most significant boost over the next few years. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for letting me be part of WEO Week, which you cannot say 5 times fast. But before I get my comments, I just have to say, it's really been remarkable how much you and your team and all of your colleagues at IEA have been able to contribute to the conversations over this past year about what this moment in time means. And you should all be congratulated. You definitely deserve a full week to unpack the work that you've done in the WEO. So very pleased to be part of it. We are still in a position where there's a change in the administration here in the United States. That I could go through all of the implications of that with my crystal ball in hand, but I won't do that right now. What I think is the most important thing to focus on, which ties to the excellent presentation that Christoph and Daniel gave and the work that you've done in the WEO, is I do think what we've seen is a step change in how we in the United States need to think about, and countries around the world need to think about, the emissions reduction experiences we've had of the past and the ones that we need to see going forward. And so there's some really complicating factors there, but there's also a lot of reasons for hope. And I think one of the big lessons that we've learned in the United States is there's a fundamental difference between reducing emissions on a near-term basis and positioning yourself for deep decarbonization over the longer term. They are fundamentally different animals. We would like to believe that all of this will happen through an organized top-down structure where someone in power gets to say, release the engineers, and the system changes. It is not the experience that we're going to have. And we, particularly in the United States, understand we have 50 states. We have a very divided country. We have a large societal challenge that we're going to have to deal with. And I think what that means is not dissimilar to what Ed just described in dealing with different countries and their political economy and facing this challenge. We really need to take a location-based approach to how we implement the policies, the incentives, the conversation about the kind of transitions that are going to need to take place. If you just look insularly in the United States, the challenges on the West Coast versus the East Coast versus the Gulf Coast versus the middle of the country will be fundamentally different. And I think a couple of the things that you've talked about in the WEO this year and in the net zero emissions scenario are really helpful for keeping in mind, how do you connect what is fundamentally an energy system challenge, an energy and agricultural system challenge, you would say, but an energy system challenge with the lives and livelihoods of daily American citizens or daily global citizens? And I think this is what we're going to have to do when we think about the scaling up that is required. It is not just a matter of thinking about, okay, well, how would we do, as you say, triple the amount of power sector investment, or how would we, increase the amount of renewables in the electric power sector, from 27% to 60% or whatever it was by 2030. It's how do you actually make the factories that do that, and how do they impact the local communities that you want to have buy-in in being able to do that? What kind of capacity building do you have to do? What kind of human workforce training do you have to do? How do you communicate that to these communities that are going to be impacted? And how do you make that not just, as we've seen in certain parts of the world, platitudes about the green energy jobs to come, but the green energy quality jobs that actually materialize? And the second, which I won't go over in too much detail, which is what Ed talked about, is the phase down factor. If you look at this, there's a huge portion of the global economy that is going to have to shut down and transition. And we have to be honest with ourselves. We have been terrible at bringing everybody along in those conversations. It is not something we are fundamentally good at. We have failed in a number of accounts, but we've never tried in the same way that I think we're positioned to try today. And so this idea of transitioning communities into a new economy, it will look very different in Eastern Europe versus South Africa versus Southeast Asia versus the Appalachian region in the United States. We have a project called the Just Transition Initiative with the climate investment funds. We're looking at the political economy differences of the different places you try to do this, to try and see if there's lessons that we can bring. Finally, I think the most important thing that I think comes out in these deep decarbonization scenarios is the need for integration. And it's not just integration of, you really cannot just think on a sector by sector basis. And you see this as evidence in what the EU is putting forward, what the UK has just put forward, what I'm sure China is going to put forward. You cannot plan to get from here to where you need to be if you're only thinking sector by sector, if you're only thinking about infrastructure transition, not behavior transition. There's just a huge amount of integration of different stovepipes of public policy and different stovepipes of the energy sector that have to be thought about together. And I think that this integration challenge is both particularly challenging, but it also does offer huge amounts of opportunities to talk about co-benefits. So when Daniel was outlining some of the personal behavior challenges or changes that need to take place, I kept thinking to myself, it would be nice to believe that we're going to do those things because they're good for the environment. It's probably more practical for us to think about how do we incentivize those behaviors, and not just in terms of their environmental output, or the impact, but also in terms of the other co-benefits that they present for individuals. And we as the energy community need to get better about talking about those co-benefits, which I know you outline very well in a lot of the work that you're doing. I think we need to be very good about talking about those, because I think they'll be a part and parcel of pushing all of this forward. One more point, two more points really quickly. One is, I couldn't agree more with what Ed laid out. One of my big fears in raising ambition is that we dilute action, right? There's a horrible tendency we have in the international community to say, we haven't done enough, so I promise, 10 decades from now, I'm going to do more. That's not where we are, right? So we have to both be ambitious, but we have to think about the incremental steps that take to deliver that ambition. I think this is actually where you'll see a Biden administration really sort of, trying to think about putting their effort in the places where there'll be catalytic action towards more of this ability to do deep decarbonization. So, for example, things like, how do you create not only an auto industry of the 21st century and have it create jobs in the United States, but build the EV grid connecting infrastructure to do that as well, right? Things where you can see a multitude of benefits coming out from one sort of solid effort, because they're going to have to pick their battles. And the final thing I'll say, because I say it all the time and I think it's really important, is unfortunately the challenge is bigger than we've outlined here, because we're going to do all of this in the face of a changing climate where we're going to experience impacts. And the other part of bringing people behind is recognizing that people will feel impacts along the way. And we need to be thinking about integrating that view of what the climate changes will be over these timeframes to make sure that we build resilience, as I know you guys focus on at the IEA as well. We build resilience into these systems as well. And that's another co-benefit, particularly in the United States. I've been really pleased to see how much of the environmental justice and not leaving anyone behind, particularly in the communities that are going to feel the greatest impacts of a changing climate, has really been moved front and center in this conversation. So that gives me hope. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. This was really insightful and so many different thoughts and 360 degrees, really rich. Thank you. I would maybe just take away one thing, that we are not going to be experiencing a global energy transition, but thousands of mini local communities transitions at very local level. And clearly, it's true what you said, that it's going to be even more challenging than what we have been described here. However, we are also facing a bit of an opportunity with the recovery plans that are being put forward around the world. And wherever we can help to put these recovery plans, people front and center, and the clean and secure and resilient energy systems going forward, we will really have a big opportunity. So we should start working as much as possible on really the short-term actions, as you said, taking the piecemeal what's happening next. Thank you again, Sarah. And let me turn to Glenn onto something that is a bit of a trade union between what really the presentation that has been done and Sarah's technology. It's not clear how far we're going to go with mitigation, and we have heard that in many scenarios, including ours, the role of carbon capture and storage is going to be very important, and negative emission technologies, albeit uncertain, could play a big role. Glenn, I give you the floor. I'm giving us your insights on this.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thanks for the input and presentation so far. I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide removal, which is not really possible without slides, so I'm going to have a few slides. So at the start, Christophe and Daniel talked mainly about this period from 2020 to 2030, which is a critical period. If we don't get emissions going down in the next decade, let's say, then the ability to get net zero sort of goes away. So it's really important to get that short-term action happening. And I'm going to extend the discussion from 2030 beyond. And when you do that, you can't avoid talking about negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal. To do this, I need to step back a little bit and talk about what a scenario looks like in the background a little bit. So this here is a typical sort of stylized 1.5 degree scenario. The black line here is the net emissions. This is essentially what Christophe and Daniel were showing in their first slides. But the net emissions are made up of two components: the positive emissions, the brown here, and the negative emissions, or carbon dioxide removal in the greens here. And so you add those two components together and you get the net emissions. So when it comes to mitigation, getting out of coal, oil, and gas, we probably can't get that brown curve, emissions from fossil fuels, let's say, we probably can't get that down to zero. There's some sectors, some aspects which are too hard to mitigate. They might be too costly. Maybe there's other reasons. There's also non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, which I haven't shown. And so because we can't get everything out of the system, we need to take carbon back out of the atmosphere. So if we can't avoid putting 5 billion tonnes into the atmosphere, then we have to take 5 billion tonnes back out. And this is where carbon dioxide removal comes in. And there's two aspects to that. One part is simply to offset the emissions that we can't get out of the atmosphere, can't avoid putting into the atmosphere, which is the dark green here. And the other aspect is to bring the temperature back down. So many may not realize that a lot of scenarios will cross 1.5 degrees and then come back down towards 1.5 degrees. And they do this through carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions, and that's the green part, the light green part in this figure. So that's a general look of a scenario. If I just move forward, this is more or less what was shown in the first slide, I think, from Christoph. The two, or actually three here, scenarios from the IEA, the two green ones, the net zero by 2050, and then the net zero by 2070, essentially the sustainable development scenario. So those scenarios go down to zero and then stop. So what happens? And this is where all these questions come up about, well, does the IEA say there's negative emissions? Do they have lots of negative emissions? Not much. What's going on here? And if you look against the IPCC scenarios, for example, the 1.5 degree scenario shown here in light blue, which came out of the 1.5 degree reports, you will see that's they're very consistent with the net zero by 2050 scenario from the IEA, but then they continue down and go negative. On a global basis, they're removing carbon from the atmosphere and at a somewhat large scale. Is this necessary from the IEA scenarios? Is something we're not completely sure about. We do know something about the sustainable development scenario that goes to zero in 2070. This comes from the energy technology perspective, so I guess a sister report to the World Energy Outlook. And in that figure, the coal, oil, gas, you see, don't quite go to zero. And because of that, we need that little green part at the bottom of the figure. They've used here bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to take carbon back out of the atmosphere. And the net zero by 2050 scenario will look something like this, accelerated, and the zero line happening somewhere around 2050. Just to put this into context of other scenarios, the sustainable development scenario, so it's about 1.6, 1.7 degree temperature increase. And comparing with equivalent scenarios assessed by the IPCC, these sort of reddish orangey color here, the IEA is using much less carbon dioxide removal. This is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So quite conservative in comparison to others, which is quite interesting. Also very slow takeoff, very low levels in 2050, and the acceleration is happening in the second half of the century. So that's the sort of the background in terms of sort of numbers and, you know, the sort of key points, and I've framed them here as questions that comes out of this. You know, what level of carbon dioxide removal is needed? So some level is needed. That's I don't think there'll be too much dispute about that, but how much we need, I think, is an interesting point. So for the IEA, you know, what does the energy system look like in 2050 when it's net zero? Is it like the sustainable development scenario moved forward to 2050? What's happening with coal? What's happening with oil and gas? How much oil do we need in 2050, for example? How much negative emissions do we need in 2050 to offset what we can't get rid of? So that'll be interesting to see in the next year's World Energy Outlook. Fingers crossed. What happens after net zero is interesting as well. So we hit zero in 2050, hopefully. Then what happens? Do we continue down into negative territory? How does the energy system look like then? Or do we just stay at zero, maintain zero? What does the energy system look like? How long can we maintain large-scale carbon dioxide removal? And then another sort of question which, you know, touches on my last slide that I had. What scale does the IEA think is possible in terms of carbon dioxide removal? There's quite a few different technologies. Each have their advantages and disadvantages. So what's the scale of these different technologies, and what speed can we deploy these technologies? Very interesting and important questions. Digging into those, then it sort of starts to get a little bit out of the energy sector. What about afforestation, so growing trees? What about non-CO2 emissions in agriculture? What can we do there which may reduce the need for carbon dioxide removal, and so on? So lots of interesting things to discuss. I'll finish there and hand back over to Lara. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Actually, always with your presentations, we learn something more about our own analysis, which is actually great. It doesn't happen very often. I'd have thousands of questions to ask, but in the interest of time, and I think we'll have all our eyes on China and Professor Zhu Ji, so I'm going to move to him. We have had this very welcome announcement and hugely consequential for global CO2 emissions of your President Xi Jinping getting to net zero by 2060. And now again, all eyes on China on the next 5-year plan. what we should be expecting out of it, Professor Zhuji. We're really very much looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very delighted to join this conversation. In fact, within 5 minutes for intervention, I have 3 points to make. Yes, certainly. Number one, I would like to emphasize the importance of a 14th Five-Year Plan as a very important starting point for neutrality in before or in 2060. And for 14th Five-Year Plan, I think the most important thing for the moment is to reflect the urgency and the consistency for the 2060 neutrality. That means we need to set up very ambitious, very high targets for 14 Five-Year Plan in order for us to shift to the right pathway towards neutrality. And having said that, I believe to try our best to reach peak by the end of 14 Five-Year Plan period, that's 2025, will be a very, very important thing. And in the meanwhile, it's not only the matter of peaking time, but also the matter of peaking level, and also by which driver you reach peak. But certainly it will be the business for 15 Five-Year Plan. I mean, between 2026 to 2030 to finally to examine if the peak is stable, is the real peak without a significant rebound. But anyway, I think we should try to do the first thing, I mean, peaking by 2025. But certainly, China is so big, and different provinces and the cities, they are at different development level. And I mean, having said that, I mean, we should make some more developed or richer cities and the provinces to reach peak earlier. That means within 14 Five-Year Plan, some of the developed provinces and cities, they should reach peak earlier than the rest of the country. The second point I would like to make is the sectoral efforts. No need to say we should allocate emission target to different sectors, especially power industry. But for industry, we also have several prioritized sectors like iron, steel, cement, chemical and petrochemical, and the transport, etc. And also to identify and determine the technological options for different sectors to achieve their allocated targets. And especially, I would like to emphasize efficiency improvement again. I mean, emphasize the importance of efficiency improvement. I would say in the coming decades, efficiency in different sectors will continue to be the major driver to ensure the emission trajectory decline significantly. These include the efficiency in power sector, different industrial sectors, transport and building. Here, while we are so exciting to talk about the electric vehicle, I would also emphasize the efficiency management for the stock of combustion engine cars. They have very large stock. They will last another 10 to 20 years. So fuel economy for those stock of combustion engine car will continue to be very important. And the other thing I would like to emphasize is digitalization in conventional sector and for efficiency improvement. And recently we saw some ICT companies, they try to fund their application occasion for different sectors. These, I would assume this will lead to very huge improvement of energy efficiency for many sectors. But certainly, we should also need to set up incentives and a clear signal for expectation of investors and the technology developer. The other thing for sector to stop additional capital investment in coal-fired power plant. That's the first urgency for the moment. And this also to make generation hours for the existing coal-fired generators get lower and lower. This is another important thing for coal-fired power plant. With the assumption, I mean, they will be phased out within 10 or even 20 years. No need to say, together with the increase of electricity, enlarging non-fossil fuel share will continue to be important, especially when we look at the renewable. I mean, both centralized renewable from North China or Northeastern China and Northwestern China, and the distributed renewable, they should be developed largely in parallel manners. Finally, I would like to emphasize transport. I know everybody are very exciting on electric vehicle. We should develop some policy to accelerate the pace for electric vehicle. For example, to set up the ban to sell combustion engine car. I mean, to make the timetable very clear. And the last point I would like to make is policy and institutional reform. No need to say air quality policy will continue to serve as the driver for co-control or co-benefit of climate policy. And also carbon market. We should relaunch carbon market policy in the view to provide for incentive for low carbon industry and investment. One very specific thing, and to develop a tradable green certificate for higher share renewable in the grid, and also provide for convenience for investment in renewable. I see time flies very fast, so I stop here for comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhu Ji. Really comprehensive, and certainly we'll have all the eyes looking at China and working together on this next 5-year plan and continue our strong cooperation. Largest investor today in renewables, in nuclear, in energy efficiency, so brought about the largest drops in solar. Certainly we're gonna look at China for the next steps. I see indeed, as Professor Zhu Ji said, the time is flying very fast. We are basically at 3 o'clock, which is the time we had set for the closure of this event. We have received a few questions. We didn't manage to respond to them. We are making all our efforts to respond to you via email, so please be patient. We just went a bit longer, but I think it was so rich and very interesting. So let me thank again all our panelists, Ed, Sarah, Glenn, Professor Zhu Ji. Let me thank again Christoph and Daniel for their excellent presentation. Thanks to all of you that have followed us. My colleagues tell me that we have 500 as basic throughout this hour. I invite you to join us again tomorrow for our last day of WEO week that will focus on investing in clean energy transitions, that will try really to gather many of the discussions we have had over this past week. I thank you once again, and I applaud all our panelists today. Thank you.